architecture. And it's not one clear, defined thing. There's different groups pursuing different aspects of it. But of all of these, the only one that is actually living is this coat. And so I think it deserves special recognition because the program in Barcelona in particular describes its goal as being, let me give you the actual quote. Sorry. Quote, buildings whose walls and ceilings grow their own flesh and skin and therefore will never need repainting. End quote. So literal organisms, I imagine this little coat being the shape of a house, but it's not even that. It might look like that skyscraper in Dubai, but the idea is that it would actually be a living structure. So I want to give you a definition of genetic architecture that comes out of the school in Barcelona. Quote, the fusion of cybernetic digital resources with genetics to continuously join the zeros and ones from the architectural drawing with those from the robotized manipulation of DNA in order to organize the necessary genetic information that governs a habitable, living being's natural growth according to designs previously prepared on a computer. So talk about linking all kinds of things that people here said they're interested in. It's a pretty interesting goal to try to achieve this type of vision. And I think it has a number of problems and issues attached to it. All right, so I want to go back in time and give you the main bulk of my argument that links streamlining in design to ideas of eugenics. When I began this project, I think I already mentioned, I actually didn't even know anything about eugenics from my graduate school studies. I had evolutionary theory and issues of kind of racial class discrimination based on evolutionary ideas. That was present all the time, but nobody talked about eugenics. Well, in fact, the main designer who I began my project working on at the University of Texas, his papers are there, Norman Belgetti's, he was fascinated with eugenics. And so that began my introduction to the subject. And in fact, he was an amateur breeder. And there's no mention of this really in histories of streamlining prior to my bringing in this kind of biological evolutionary side. This is actually a photo of him, I believe, in his New York apartment. Between 1927 and 35, he had aquariums and terrariums, and I think you can see one behind him. That he actually had one that was 20 foot by 4 foot by 3 foot, and he had over 2,000 insects, amphibia, and reptiles that he bred. He actually made mating films of these things, which are in his archive as well. And he was an amateur breeder as well. He did some experiments with eels that were actually praised by the American Museum of Natural History. So he was an interesting guy who was dabbling in theater design, early industrial design, breeding. And at the same time, in 1932, he wrote a book called Horizons, which was the kind of manifesto of streamlined design. So I began to kind of look at his broader life and his broader belief systems, and then other designers as well from the period to look at this broader kind of fusion of scientific belief with design theory. For example, Raymond Loewy, who's another famous designer from this period, loved to make evolution charts, and you're just seeing 6 of them here. I don't even know how many there are total. But you can see that he's charting a fairly consistent path from a random selection of starting dates, 1600, 1830s, 17, whatever, to basically 1930s and perhaps a little bit beyond in some of these. I'll show you a couple other ones later. But you can see that the overall pattern goes from cluttered, ornamented, things sticking out every which way, to absolutely kind of minimalistic, brought under a single shell, clean type of hygienic modern design that we associate with, I think, streamlined design and international style design of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. One of the things that I think is interesting is to look at the ideas by which ornament and these types of kind of protrusions and heavy kind of excessiveness were described in kind of popular scientific and popular jargon. And Adolf Loos, an Austrian kind of architectural theorist, he talked, I derived this interpretation from his essay, Ornament as Crime, or Ornament and Crime, excuse me, where he basically says primitives tattoo themselves, therefore ornamentation is a primitive trait. If we're going to be modern people, we can't go back to ornamentation. We must erase that past and move into modern design. That's a huge oversimplification of his argument. But that's kind of the current idea where ornament was heralded as primitive and degenerate by most of these designers, and it was used as the rationale for why they had to get rid of that type of design. One of the things that I think is interesting about this chart, though, is there's no clear agent of this evolution. It's as if design is evolving on its own, just like nature evolves. And that's something many people, I think, still believe today, or at least they use that. I went to a conference in the Netherlands a few years ago on design and evolution, and many of the talks were about the evolution of the computer mouse, or the evolution of something. And I think that's a key point to be talked about too. Is it actually evolving? Is it a metaphor? What do you mean when you say that? How are these principles being applied? So in terms of thinking about what streamlining is, in Getty's book, he did this diagram on the left, which shows you a flowing stream with an object moving against it in the opposite direction. A square, a sphere, and then this perfect teardrop shape. Oh, and by the way, I brought in a couple things. I just love it. The glowing, I don't know, is it a larva? Lamp? I was going to use it to light my talk if I had to. But it's a perfect example of streamlined design. Not only because it's molded plastic, which is key to why streamlining happened. It pours into curved molds really easy. It's kind of changing material science, produces changes in actual structure. But he had a whole theory about eliminating what he called parasite drag, which are all of these little eddies that you see diagrammed behind the first two, but that disappear when you get the perfect streamlined form. Based on this diagram, and based on the fact that a lot of vehicles, including this prototype for, I don't know, is it an early minivan? Here on the right that never got mass produced. Streamlined design was used for vehicles. And because of this, many of the histories talk about fluid efficiency, aerodynamics as the reason for the style. I have kind of gone back, I don't dispute that at all, but I also want to add kind of the biological basis and argument for this theory that I think infuses another different rationale for why the style happened when it did. One of the things that critics pointed out, you can see all of these various designs have streamlined details in terms of that teardrop shape, whether it's kind of severed, cross-section, shifted, 3D, whatever. Critics accuse streamlined designers of being bad designers because they basically said, if streamlining is about efficiency in a fluid, why would you streamline immobile product designs? And they basically faulted them for selling out to the public, being kind of faddish, you know, all of these other reasons why they dissed streamlining. But one of the things that I was interested in as an art historian is, well, okay, so if it was bad design and dishonest design, and these guys were actually really intelligent people and good designers, why would they do this? You know, there's a conflict of interest there. So I'm curious about the bigger historical context that causes this to happen as a widespread phenomenon, not just thinking that it's bad design. Well, so in going back through designers' archives, I came across, you know, point after point and speech after speech that had evolutionary ideas beneath it. One of the ones that I want to show here is, these are two lantern slides from a talk that Egmont Ahrens, a designer, an advertising designer, did in the 1930s, called Streamlining in Nature. He toured high schools and corporate offices and actually wrote to Franklin Roosevelt saying, streamlining in nature, we need to streamline the US as part of the New Deal. And you know, it's like his thing. You see here that his diagram of streamlines doesn't look like what Getty's gave you as the perfect teardrop form. It's actually much more like the torso of the greyhound. And he said in his talk, when he showed the slide of the greyhound, he said, greyhounds were being bred for lines like these long before engineers discovered the slipstream, which in my mind points, in his mind, to a genetic breeding origin for this type of efficient design that took precedent over slipstream aero and fluid dynamics. So out of not only just kind of his papers and Raymond Loewy's and Norman Bel-Geddes, I ended up coming up with a full-blown realization or argument that point for point, the major goals of streamlined designers mirrored the goals of eugenicists. And I had not heard anything about eugenics, and I hadn't thought about, wow, you mean the way people conceive of bodies gets translated into the way they think about product design? How do we make sense out of this? And so that's basically what my book does, chapter by chapter, is show these two things in tandem with each other. So both types of designers aim to eliminate degeneracy through controlled evolution. They aim to increase the smooth flow of the stream. They wanted to increase biological efficiency, hygiene and sterilization, and achieve the ideal type. So I just want to briefly go back through the history of eugenics to give you that on that side, and then I'll move on from there. Many people think that eugenics was only popular in Europe, which is not the case. The US was a hotbed of it and actually put forward many of the ideas. There is more funding for eugenics research here than almost anywhere else in the world. I looked at that history of science side of it, but I also looked at the popular side. There was a group called the American Eugenics Society. They went to state fairs and world's fairs throughout the 20s and 30s. And they did things like what you see on the left. Set up a booth, have public lectures, talks at all times. You could actually